This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Thank you. So our next presentation is by Dr. Meena Dhanda. Dr. Meena Dhanda is a reader in philosophy and cultural politics at the University of Wolverhampton. She came to Oxford University from the Indian Punjab as a Commonwealth scholar and was later awarded Rose JRF at the University of Oxford. Her first publication on the question of caste and untouchability was an article in 1993, Le veille des intouchables, un end, le respect de l'estime à la différence, une question délimitée, which she wished had been published in English, and as she does not read French. She was able to include some of her ideas on the problematic question of the identity of a Dali in her Doctor of Philosophy, which was later published as The Negotiation of Personal Identity. She is very interested in questions of intersecting discriminations, and in her collection, Reservation for Women, she touches upon gender and caste. From 2007, she had engaged in transdisciplinary studies connected with caste, publishing several papers, including Punjabi Dali Youth, Social Dynamics of Transitions in Identity, Runaway Marriages, A Silent Revolution, and Do Only South Asians Reclaim Honor? In 2010, she wrote a report on understanding disparities in student attainment, Black, minority ethnic students' experience, exploring reasons for the attainment gap in her university. As a Leavenhulme Research Fellow, she conducted primary research on Punjab Dali on her project Caste Aside, a philosophical study of cultural identity resistance of Punjabi Dali. She has recently led a team of expert researchers on a project on caste in Britain, commissioned by the Equality and Human Rights Commission UK, and published 2 substantial research reports. MA, Caste in Britain, Socio-Legal Review. Equality and Human Rights Commission Research Report number 91, and Dhanda MAR, Caste in Britain Expert Seminar and Stakeholders Workshop. Equality and Human Rights Commission Research Report number 92. Alongside other thinkers, she teaches Berka and Fanon in her philosophy course, Self and Other, The Demands of Social Justice at the University of Wolverhampton. She is an active member of the Society for Women in Philosophy UK for more than 25 years and urges all women philosophers present here to join it. So, Dr. Meena, it is over to you.
Thank you. Unlike the earlier speakers, I'm using PowerPoint, which has its advantages and disadvantages. At some points, I might be skipping through things which you might think I'm depriving you of something, but don't mind if I do it. On the other hand, there might be times when I might pause and I forget the PowerPoint and carry on. I so want to first thank Nathaniel for this absolutely marvelous opportunity, and from all the emails we got from various people, I am overwhelmed, just echoing what was said by Robert before, by the expertise that is present today. And I so hope that my very chaotic ideas that I'm trying to present today will become a bit more fine-tuned after our discussion today. And particularly because as a philosopher, I find it difficult to stand at that border where I'm so engaged in finding out about what's going on in the world, and then trying to think as a philosopher, what can I say about it, which will make sense both to philosophers as well as to those who are my primary interlocutors. I think of myself as having a continued commitment to this constituency of people about whom I am writing. In one sense, if I have to make a judgment, I am less concerned about whether philosophers will go away having learned something from it. I am more concerned that what I'm saying will make a difference somewhere. So I'm talking about a practical matter today, which is enacting legal protection against caste-discrimination, and there is a delay. I hope that in the process you will get some sense of what deep underlying issues are there which is preventing this from going forward. So that's my concern. Hope I can get it to first move. Right, so my talk is going to be in 4 parts. I'll talk about the meaning of caste and its relation to race, the UK experience in particular, some incidences, the migration history, what is going on in the public discourse, and then a little bit about the Equality Act. And I'm so grateful that Anara has, at the start of the day, given us a lot of detail about what it includes, so I don't have to explain anything. You know already quite a bit about what is the purpose of the Act. A little bit I'll say about what we found in our project, which was concluded in January this year, and then some general philosophical reflections which arise from trying to offer what is underlying the delay that is stopping the legal implementation of the legal requirement. So what does caste mean and how is it related to race? I want to take the meaning of caste primarily that it lies in how it is used. I don't want to try to go into the ways social theorists go into it. Nonetheless, it's important to recall that that's what academics, social anthropologists, social theorists have been saying about caste. It is birth ascribed status. It is sometimes explained in functionalist terms as if it is tied to occupation. It is sometimes explained in terms of a hierarchical order where ritual purity or pollution matters. In any case, it's a combination of different elements. There's some element of social class in it. So once caste ties you to a social class, there's some element of hierarchy in it, and there is some element of privilege in it. So inequality is quite a key element in understanding what caste is. And all of this is tied together by endogamy, a certain practice of people being born into a caste, and various constraints connected with maintaining that order by policing that order of who you can marry or not. I want to go back a little bit to those who have been public reformers, if you like, who have addressed the question of caste and also have seen it in connection with race. So Jyotiba Phule is a Marathi public reformer who wrote mostly in Marathi, and he compares caste to what European settlers have done to the American Indians, and he says there's a parallel in India that caste is that parallel, that it is a codification of crude and inhuman laws. And we can't find anything like this anywhere else. His follower, if you like, someone very much inspired by him, was Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, who's also one of the people responsible for the Indian Constitution. And for B.R. Ambedkar, who differed with, began to differ with Jyotiba Phule's theory about the Aryan invasion and so on, B.R. Ambedkar's view is tied to thinking of caste as connected with a division not just of labor, but a division of laborers. It's something that prevents the working class, the laborers, from getting together. And the interesting thing about it is that every group that finds itself in a place can both find someone above them and someone below them. So it's a graded inequality, and that is also what prevents people from thinking in terms of equality, because to give up whatever caste status they have in that hierarchy, they fear that they will lose the advantage that they have over the next one down. So that's a big obstacle, and this is very peculiar and interesting about the caste system. Unlike a binary system where you might divide people into just 2 groups, the fact that it is many groups is a complication in moving towards equality. So he calls it an enclosed class, and again he emphasizes that endogamy, which is marrying within your own group, the explanation is a little more complex, but we don't have the time to go into it. There's exogamy and endogamy, but I can't really explain it in the break. If people want to, I can. So Ambedkar wrote this marvelous essay, Annihilation of Caste, which has recently been republished with an introduction by an author you might be familiar with, Arundhati Roy, and it is back in the public discussion, particularly in India, but perhaps also here. And she has written a longish introduction where the Doctor and the Saint, where she compares Ambedkar with Gandhi. And I'm just coming to Gandhi next. But before that, for Ambedkar, the characterization of Hindus or Hinduism as well is very, very crucial to understanding where he places caste. And that is also the point of difference that Ambedkar has with many other people. So he engaged in a long discussion, well, not directly, but he commented on Radhakrishnan, another philosopher, Indian philosopher who was also educated here, became the president of India. Now Radhakrishnan gives a lot of importance to the Upanishad, the Vedic philosophy, and there is evidence in the Upanishad, there are some shlokas in the Upanishad which suggest that there is fluidity, and Radhakrishnan want to conclude on that basis that caste isn't really fixed, that people, and that the reality of our existence really lies in something which is beyond this world. So he wants to focus on the beyond the here and now, and Ambedkar wants to bring him back to the here and now, and he wants to say that, look, after the Vedic times, you had successive changes. Historically, if you look at it, then there were the Buddhas, the Mauryans, and then there was the Manusmriti, which is the law book, a codification of laws. And for Ambedkar, Manusmriti is extremely important in having. It's not that it's not that Manu created the caste system. He didn't do anything like that. He can't be blamed for it, but whatever is included in the Manusmriti has had its effect over the centuries, and it has been used by different people over a period of time, so that remnants of that still remain. We still have got some of the rules which are part of the Manusmriti, and it's fascinating reading if you want to. I suggest that if you want to really understand, it would be great to see how things get codified. So here's M.K. Gandhi, who you might know in a different guise. The important thing about Mahatma Gandhi is that he was a defender of the caste system. He wrote this text called the Varnashram Dharam. He was against untouchability, and he tried to, in his ashrams, make people who are maybe Brahmins do the job of sweeping. But this is so close to the discussion we had earlier about a systemic casteism and the focus on independent individuals' intentions. Gandhi was only addressing intentions. Okay, come and do this. And you have to rely on the goodwill of Hindus to change the system. Well, you do have to rely on the goodwill of Hindus somewhat, because if not enough of them want to change the system, it's not going to change. But for Ambedkar, the most important thing was the system, not the individuals. So here's Gandhi, he says quite clearly that hereditary occupation is the soul of the caste system, and so much so that he's saying to change it to create disorder. So not only he's saying you get on and change it, he's saying don't do it. That's stronger than what you would expect for someone. And of course now in Arundhati Roy's article there's also evidence of Gandhi's racism, things that he said at the time that he was in Africa. But I'm not going into that. So he clearly said that he was opposed to anyone who's trying to destroy the caste system. There are many, many modern day supporters of this line. So we are at a point in India where after the Constitution of 1950, after so many years of untouchability being ignored, after there being several legal measures to try and check it, we now have a renewed interest in owning up caste. Towards the end of my lecture, I will come to a person who I was expecting to be here, Professor Parekh, but he isn't here. But he's a lot in the Parliament, and we'll see what he says towards the end. So I said that you have to understand caste in terms of manifestation. So of course there's heredity, there's endogamy, there's stratification of higher and lower, but it does get manifested, in its manifestation there is fluidity. So a caste which is high in one place may not be high in another place. There are lots of regional variations, and it can be quite difficult in the Indian context of how law is implemented. So if you're protected by or have a special status for reservation in one region, you may not get that in another region. That's a problem. There isn't one. There is a one national list, but the way it works across regions is not very useful sometimes. And there's an ongoing discussion about whether, for example, the protection of the Prevention of Atrocities Act in India, which came in 1989, whether it needs to be rethought, and there's all sorts of discussion going on there. So there is fluidity. But caste does work as a constraint. It is linked to deprivation. It is linked to atrocities and violence. Yesterday there was a demo outside the Indian High Commission following incident you might have heard of the rape of two very young girls in the state of Uttar Pradesh. And about 400 odd people yesterday got together to protest against the authorities for not doing anything about it. The rapists included police constables. That's very symptomatic of how things happen in India. Nothing going to be done because functionaries of the authorities are out of that system which upholds casteism. So an interesting element also of caste, which came up quite a lot in our project, was that it is a matter of brotherhood and solidarity. It is a matter of pride for some people. In South Asia, it is acknowledged to be a part of life. In what sense a part of life? Okay, there's a difference there of what people think about it. It is definitely tied to unequal access to valued resources, where you can have water or not, whether you can have housing or not. All of these aspects are connected to your caste position. It is certainly connected to humiliation of certain groups who are considered socially inferior. Nobody will really dispute this. People can dispute the extent of it. People can dispute whether it's continuing, where and how it is, how it will go away. But these are facts. Characteristics of the system as it exists in South Asia is undeniable. Now, if you want to compare caste in the context of race, there was an interesting conference here in London in 1966 by the SIBA Foundation, where a social anthropologist, sociologists got together, and some of you might recognize the one, for example, and Bellman, and they talked about how we can connect. Can we see race in terms of caste as it had been done in the 30s, or now can we see caste in terms of race, vice versa. They noted, of course, that casteism is present in many other places, not just South Asia or in Africa or America, it's also in Japan and in East Africa. And it was, again, underlined by some people, Bellman, for example, that it is an institutionalized inequality. I think that's an important part of it. But there are beginnings of this, again, the view that the one has put forward that maybe there is something essential about Indian society, that it has to be thought in terms of inequality, and that that hierarchy is an aspect of it. And why should we impose another right? Why should we take for granted that equality, which is a Western idea, so to speak, has to be imposed on another society? Now this is echoed later on in, which I will come to again in a minute, about turning around what was the purpose of an Orientalist critique of Western thought. It is trying to make room for inequality by not looking at the intent of that Orientalist thought, which was humanism, making everyone a part of the one world, but twisting it to then say the West's view of us is not true to what we really are. Okay, and that's a very dangerous thing to do. It has happened. It continues to happen. Another point which was a part of that conference, and it's relevant for us here, is that the maintaining of boundaries between castes in order to continue it, to perpetuate it, is underlined. That caste is a living environment, and although academics try to intellectual ideas. For people who live it, it's a day-to-day reality, and that's what we have to remember. And the area in which it is most stringently regulated is marriage and sexual relations. There is disequilibrium, things are changing, but it persists. Okay. And it persists because there are sanctions for not following it. It's not because there is an agreement, people just agree that it's a great thing to live by these norms. It's because it is maintained, is enforced. And modernization by itself is not going to get rid of this systemic aspect of casteism. So whilst people may try to pass off, individual people may try to, and this is referred to again by Lord Nicobarek, I will mention at the end, it is not possible for people to permanently masquerade. The system catches you. There are so many things you have to do in where you have to declare who you are. It might be rituals, it might be finding a partner for your children, and those are the things which will then make your caste chase you, and regardless of whether you want to be of that caste, it will be you. Okay, so that's a problem that we have to deal with. And now come to the second part, to the UK. How are things in the UK? Some people say caste came to Britain with the migrants. I think it's not a very helpful way of putting it. It couldn't have come, it might have not survived here, it might have died if Britain had been a different society. Nobody just brings things with them. Right? People come with their aspirations, and the people came here for jobs. You know, we have the earliest reference for people coming from Goa, seafarers, the Sikh soldiers who fought in the World War I, and then there were peddlers from Punjab who came in the 1920s, and majority of peoples of South Asia came in the 1950s and 60s to fill labor shortages. And at the time when they came, they lived together. The writings of the early times are very interesting, that people of higher and lower caste actually shared accommodation. They partook in the rituals, common rituals and festivities, etc. So caste didn't come with them in that sense. They weren't following it at that one point of time. But then they began to follow it. The more of them came, and that's an interesting thing in itself to see how does it happen that those beliefs which could have remained, could have disappeared, reappear. Okay, and what is it about in modernization itself which encourages that to happen? So mostly caste people who came from Punjab, but there's a difference between migrants, Punjabi and Gujarati migrants. There is a long established tradition of organizations, religious, social organizations which are caste-based in this country. And why did they emerge? Well, one of the things I think is that, for example, the Indian Workers Association never had anti-casteism as an explicit agenda. And that is a problem. There were lots of factional rivalries. People want to be the head of this or that community group or community sector and so on, and that leads to all sorts of differentiations between castes. And also the immigration restrictions of the 1970s. Because of that, people set up community organizations so that they can find for the young ones or the young people partners from their own caste. So it's very interesting to see how completely the immigration restriction for another purpose has led to perpetuation of caste hierarchies and caste differences in this country. The early public discourse in on caste goes quite a long way back, 1990s, 1993, various instances of caste discrimination are noted. For example, Dalits have also taken up action. A shopkeeper who's behaving in a casteist way has been forced out of his, the place where he had his shop. There are conversions in 1990s in Wolverhampton. About 300 people converted. This was on a crucial anniversary of Ambedkar's birth that this happened. 300 conversions to Buddhism. But then people who became Buddhists also started receiving threats from other Asians. Through the 2000s, the awareness of caste issues remains hidden. I think I'm going to have to quickly go through it. I'm aware of that. Might be running short of time. But Satpal Movement, who became later the chairperson of Caste Watch UK, had a very presently in 2000 said that if we raise the issue of caste now, we are going to be seen as divisive. And some people might even also think that there will be a backlash, at least from the conservative elements of the Indian community, by putting caste, because we're putting caste in the public domain. And the right-wing fascists could use this also to further this aim. This is happening now. And this is what he said in 2000 after the campaign, the activism to bring in Caste Inequality Act has happened. So in that statement, he clearly points out that questions about caste are raised in school playgrounds, in pubs, in the factory floor, and incidents like a shopkeeper refusing to take change from a customer because they are of a lower caste, or not drinking water from the same tap in the factory. This has been reported. And if one thinks, oh, this was in 2000, these are old cases, which is what being said by some, that's not true. I will say in a minute what recent cases do. So his demand was at the time that laws which address discrimination based on racism should be cognizant of casteism and place it on par with racism. And that was quite an important cry, which later on became the basis of a campaign to include caste inequality law. A report by the Dalit Solidarity Network UK in 2006 also clearly showed that identity of South Asians here was based on caste. There was violence, intimidation, inclusion, and said that officially there is a need to acknowledge the existence of caste as a form of discrimination. We did a pilot study in 2009 on some people who have converted, and what we found was that caste was recognized as something which is permanent and deeply embedded. People use very emotive language to describe it. It's a monster, it's a disease, it sticks. That's how they talk about what caste means. These are people who left the Hindu fold and either become Buddhists or become Christians. So it's possible for them to talk in these very strong terms. Many who do not do that might hesitate to use this language, but they do feel a powerlessness in relation to caste. It is something that is done to you, something you're lumbered with, something you can't escape. An instance of caste discrimination in the literature, there are reports by various organizations. There was a government-sponsored report as well. There's incidents of bullying, name-calling in religious practices as well within religious institutions, which are otherwise committed to the idea of equality. The irony is that, whether it's Gurdwara, the temples who proclaim equality, do not check practices of discrimination. They're always usually relegated to this individual is bad. It's not. So if you don't do anything about it, you don't own the responsibility for not doing anything about it. It's the individual who has to apologize or take the blame for it, whilst the practice continues. That's happening even today. In the workplace, it also continues. Some recent incidents. In 2009, there was a large group of Nepalese who came to Britain, and newer cases now emerge. So a Nepalese Gurkha being refused a rental accommodation as soon as the landlord finds out that he is of a lower caste. Now this would be actionable under the Equality Act if it became a part of the Equality Act. And other stereotypes are used. For example, somebody is wanting to get a pizza franchise in Coventry, and the competitor goes and tells the person who's selling, do you know he's of the lower caste? He can't do this work. And so this is subtle. It's not going to be possible to prove it in a court maybe, or very hard to prove it in a court, but it is a form of a practice of untouchability. It happens in the way it is reported to happen. Refusal of taxi service. I keep being sent emails and contact by people who face these cases. So learn about it even though it's not really in the public domain, as in it's not being published or written about. So there's Glasgow cases ongoing. And the last one was a sad one that came to me directly. It's of a young man who wrote a letter. This was in June 2011, just 1 year into my Leave a Human project, and I don't want to discuss it too much, but But he wrote this letter about his story, and then I heard nothing. I tried to get in touch with him, heard nothing. 3 months later, in September 2011, his sister wrote to me that she found on his laptop that he'd written me this letter, and within a day, 24 hours of writing to me, he had committed suicide. And so that is not going to be a case in the real sense of it, but just to mark that this is the severity of what people face even in this country. This is a person from the Midlands to whom this happened. There is a big contest between the Hindu view of the situation and the Dalit view of the situation. So the Hindu Council of UK insists that Hindus have to preserve their own core beliefs, and they can socialize with whoever they like, and they can have whoever life partner they want to. And then they also want to claim the Dalits as part of Hindus. And this goes a long way. I mentioned Radhakrishnan and I mentioned the Vedantic view. Now, if you take that view of Hinduism, you would say Dalits are not separate, they are a part of Hindus. And this is what the Hindu Council wants to say now as well, that to use the term Dalit itself, to call somebody Krashtra, is a derogatory epithet. That's what they say. And this whole thing is very cannily worded to fit the government's cohesion agenda. It's being made as if those who are raising this question of caste are the ones who are divisive. We want everybody to be a part of us. They are unnecessarily divided us. Yeah, that's the line that they are taking. So the word Dalit, of course, is a political term of self-identification. For some people, including some Dalits, sometimes don't want to use it. They do regard it as offensive. It's not as if there's a divide on one side, non-Dalits within the Dalits themselves. Some people don't want to use it, and it does really mean it's similar to the way the word black was used in the American context. And in fact, there is a connection. The Dalit Panthers in the 70s in Maharashtra were formed as a group parallel to the Black Panthers. Okay, now this brings me to our study, the EHRC's funded project that we did, and it will interest you that caste as a ground for discrimination is actually included in the constitution of all the countries listed on the left, but it's not included in Bhutan and Maldives. And outside South Asia, too, caste as a ground for non-discrimination exists in the constitution of these countries, Mauritius, Burkina Faso, and the African constitution, but not Canada, Fiji, or South Africa, where you would expect, given that the populations are there. In international law, it has been discussed in the context of CERD, the Committee for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. India did not like the fact that caste was going to be seen or considered to be a part of race. And the Indian response to CERD is quite explicit in some sociologists' view. For example, Dipankar Gupta, who rejects caste discrimination as race discrimination. And he refers to what he calls caste patriotism, that no caste really accepted the notion that they were inferior. And he says, well, look, everybody thinks that they are good, because it's a graded inequality. They're good with respect to the one who is below them. So that's the reason why people think that they are good. But it's being presented as if this isn't a problem. Gradation, inequality isn't a problem. The response to the Dipankar Gupta is actually quite neat by Balmulli Natarajan, that this notion that everyone accepts themselves as no less than any other is irrelevant, because there are so many castes who not only think they are superior but actually use violent means to impose that superiority on others. The British domestic law and caste, this is thanks to my colleague Anupurna Golkre, who is a part in the project with me. I'll just bring very quickly to the last point, that what we have now is, through the Enterprise and Regulatory Reform Act, Section 97, caste has to be included in the Equality Act. But it will need a secondary legislation. So that's where we are. A lot of activism has taken place. And this is what the Equality Act now looks like. The House of Lords had suggested that caste should be added under race as a fifth category, but that was defeated. And what has happened in turn is that the ministers have to make an order. Earlier it was just, they were allowed to, they could have, but now it is an obligation that they have to make an order. So our project reports we were asked to do this project in order to help the Government Equality Office to devise this secondary legislation. The reports were published in February. There is still no sign of the consultation paper which the GAO is supposed to bring out. What we found, of course, was that there is an associational value associated with caste. It is found across all religions, Muslims, Hindus, Sikhs, etc. It's not necessarily declining, and incidents continue to surface. So the present state of play is this, that by a ministerial order, there has to be an extensive public consultation. It has not yet started. And there is a pressure on government ministers by the Alliance of Hindu Organization to actually take it back, as if to remove the word caste from the legislation. That is what we are now. In the process of what we did, we tried to, in the public engagement, make it as inclusive as possible and to break through this atmosphere of mistrust, try to pool ideas. We had the event with experts as well from various, and I will just don't read the next slide, just notice the number of reds in it. All of these are Hindu organizations who were a part of our project. So if they say they were not consulted, they're lying. Okay, they came, I've got all the names there, all of them came to our event. Some of them, a very handful of them, did not come. And these were the views, the stakeholder events, these were the views. The pro-legislation group said that caste is linked to Hindu scriptures. They agreed that it is no longer associated with occupation, but rules of endogamy still matter. And they want that the law should be there because it empowers the victims to come forward and it deters perpetrated from discriminating. On the other side, the anti-legislation views was that to associate caste with Hinduism is deplorable. And they think that negative treatment is unlikely and the legislation is malicious. It will actually increase the awareness of what they think is a dying institution. It threatens integration and it is unnecessary. So you won't be surprised by all of these arguments. They're so expected. We expected these to happen and they happened. After the report, we get completely different responses, to the project. So excellent work, eye-opener from the point of view of those who are for the legislation, all the Dalit, Ambedkarite, Buddhist organization. From the Hindu organization, we had a little bit of a concession. In one press release after the event I organized on the 9th of November, they said, we accept that there is evidence of geographical pockets of discrimination. Before this, they were saying there is none. But we had sent out a questionnaire and 26 statements came in, many of them from them as well, on the question, do you know of any incident or have heard of directly or indirectly of any incident of caste discrimination? Everybody on their side had said none. But as a result of that face-to-face event where they were told stories and they had to sit with others and listen to the stories, they have to issue this release afterwards that there are pockets of discrimination. Still, at the end of the report, they are insisting now that the word caste must not remain in the legislation, and now they've picked up a new terminology. They are saying that its continuous use is anti-Hindu racial and religious violence and prejudice of the highest order. Okay, so it's completely turning around what is the object of this whole inquiry. I don't want to spend too much time on this, but the Hindu Lawyers Association did send us a feedback where they did credit what we did, and they said that we had actively listened and it was a learning experience. So I'm sensing that in the alliance there are some cracks. Okay, the alliance is not all together, and this is what I would want to say in a very small way what academics, philosophers can do in intervening in a public discourse in a way that can change it a little bit. Not much, but a little bit. Now, why the delay? And I think there's a clash of interest as well as a cycle of duties, of what the MPs think are their duties. The clash of interest is simply with vote bank politics. Dalits are a minority within a minority. And so the MPs are more concerned with holding on to the larger group of their supporters in pockets where they have. Bedford is an example where even a conservative MP supported the Dalits because that's where there is a concentration and he's answerable to them. So he went against the party whip and voted for the legislation. It's a strange example. So in one sense it cuts across the right and the left. Labour itself isn't very interested. It didn't include caste and equality legislation the first time round, and it just now maybe sometimes support, sometimes doesn't support, is watching. The Government Equality Office wants to sit it out, that's also their interest, because the matter can be either decided in the Parliament or it could be decided in case laws. There are some ongoing cases, 1 or 2 cases, and people think that why not let the judges decide? And the judges will do something, but there will be conflicting judgments and it will remain a perpetual problem. So we are arguing that it must get clarity and the Parliament must proceed with its secondary legislation, which clearly includes caste in the Equality Act. And one could also say that MPs are actually protecting the interests of capital. You know, India is a big player now, so who wants to offend Indian businessmen or businessmen here who are doing business with India? A majority of them Hindus. So that's why also I think that there is trying to sit it out. In terms of duties, I think there is a genuine hesitance maybe. When they are charged with this Eurocentrism, people want to sit back and say, well, is it the case? So the alliance of, there is Anti-Caste Legislation Committee, ACLC, which is making this argument that caste is an Orientalist construction. Yeah? And it's the Orientalist construction which makes it seem bad, but otherwise it isn't bad. And those who don't know, or are not aware, or who are not listening to the right people, are influenced by this, which seems like an attack. You know, we're doing the wrong thing. And they're also concerned with this, which is a duty to respect religion and belief, and also the liberal defense of privacy. So they can't intervene in matters which are people's private lives. If somebody wants to choose to marry who they want, they do not want to think of it as a system, as a whole, how one thing connects with another thing. So if they want to leave some, they will say, okay, severe things happen in the private domain, but what can we do? It's not covered in the Equality Act. That's up to people to sort it out themselves. Let's have education, let's have something else, but not the law. Okay, so there is this mix of interests and duties, and that's where I want to start my reflections, and then I've not left enough time for discussion. First, within the British public realm, caste discrimination is not always self-evident. So it's necessary that there has to be an interpretation. Yeah. So we've heard now that they've accepted, the opposition has accepted there are pockets of discrimination, but they're still not conceding that there is a need for the law. So whose interpretation must count? Okay, who should be the lawmakers and the MPs? Who should they be listening to? The second reflection is that why does caste as an issue of anti-discrimination provoke such a strong response? So is it, I mean this is a benign explanation, is it that there really is a threat of racism? That they feel that they are vulnerable to being attacked by non-Asians or others as if by bringing out an internal problem into the open? Is that really the issue? Or, and this is, I have not been able to formulate this really as clearly at all, but I'd like help on this, that to say that casteism is a form of racism seems to imply that there are castes who are racist. But does it really follow? Is that the implication? You know, casteism might be there, but they will not be, you might not be able to identify individual people who are castes. Right? And because if you do have to identify, then you have to ask the question, what makes somebody a casteist? Okay, and then the question about border crossing. So if somebody is intent on not crossing a border, is that person a casteist? If someone wants to hold on to their identity, does it amount, are they a casteist? I'm not sure how to answer that question. So of course, while there may be no caste system, it doesn't follow that casteism is fading. Okay, you can say there is, people give this example, I am a Brahmin, but my son is a professional. You know, between families, people are taking different professions, not fitting with the systemic view of caste. Of course, even in India that's the case. You know, the system doesn't work as a system in that way, in that strict way, certainly not in the occupational way. But it doesn't mean that casteism isn't there. Like racism, which persists, casteism can also persist, as in it is a basis for humiliation, for degradation, for harassment, for victimization. In all those ways, it continues. Now, here I come to Bhikkhu Parekh. Lord Bhikkhu Parekh, who's a philosopher, political philosopher in this country, writes a lot about multiculturalism. In 2003, he wrote an article on the notion of Hindu tolerance, and he asked this question there, helpfully, that can a Hindu adopt beliefs involving rejection of the caste system and remain a Hindu? Okay. Is it necessary for a Hindu to hold on to? And he says there are three alternative answers, all there in the text. You can justify each one of them. One is that you can restrict. He can restrict his freedom of beliefs, but that would be very severely limited. He can be allowed to hold his beliefs so long as he doesn't act on them, which will be a threat to his integrity, right? Or he can live by these egalitarian beliefs, yeah? But then the cost to him is very high, that he will be cut off from his community. So his response to this is that there are constraints, but there is fluidity, it's not a completely closed system, there are options, the price is high, but there are options. Not very conclusive. And very interestingly, his uncertainty about what finally really to say about this question kind of gets settled when he comes to the House of Lords and the debate on the 22nd of April, when this is being debated in the Indian Parliament. So on the 22nd of April, Lord Bhikkhu Parekh opposed the amendment to include caste, and he argued against it. So he says it is problematic to talk about abolishing the caste system and getting rid of the hierarchy. What is it? Getting rid of the hierarchy, or is it getting rid of the principle of heredity? In either case, he says caste isn't like the same thing at all like race. So that's one. He goes on to say four major difficulties. Now, he's in the same breath saying he is sympathetic to the principle behind it, that there must be equality, but there are practical difficulties in including caste in the legislation. And then he lists these four practical difficulties. That there will be frivolous complaints based on caste, that there might be untouchability, but there is no evidence of any kind to show that caste discrimination takes place. How do you define caste? And finally, that we shouldn't have this nebulous category which we can't define enshrined in the domestic legislation. Now, if I just quickly refer to these, aren't these very familiar objections which can be raised on many other issues? For example, sexual orientation. Okay, think about sexual orientation. Each one of these, you could say, or even on gender, the early ones when it became a part of the legislation, there would be frivolous complaints. Well, each one of us is belonging to one or another gender. Does it mean that because someone is a man, someone is therefore always liable to some complaint of made-up fake complaint of sexual harassment? It's absurd to argue like that because the possibility is there by the fact of someone being a man. So the possibility is there by the fact of someone being upper caste that they may discriminate against the lower caste. Doesn't mean that there will be frivolous complaints. It's completely discounting the fact that the legal process is so hard to undertake. It's so difficult to get any lawyer to come up and take any case, even real actual cases. The one case, an employment tribunal from 2011 in this country of Vijay Beghraj, fell down because he spent so much money, he ran out of it, and for a very small reason, too difficult to explain now, the last point it didn't go through. And he's completely broke now, he can't carry on his case. That is the real life world we live in. Where will these frivolous cases come from? I think it's a very strange objection. And also similarly that there is no evidence to caste discrimination. Well, he knows there is evidence of untouchability and he thinks it's an extreme. But I have given several examples today and I hoped he would be here, he would have been here to hear them. That the category is indeterminate, well then we don't need definition. I mentioned that in response to that. We really don't need definition. We don't need it to be the very, clear. We can give examples and say this is how it works, and we can therefore be able to pick what the cases are on the basis of those examples. So to say that untouchability exists in small pockets, and it is not acceptable, but it's only an extreme case. He thinks that introducing caste as a general category is trying to catch too much and will end up catching too little. This is typical Lord Bhikkhu Parekh speak. Won't comment on it. Reflections further. I think I said in my abstract I will talk more about Linda, but I haven't managed to because there's a balance of informing you all about where the debate is and getting to here. The main point from here is the Hindus are also constructing this supposedly decolonized version of their identity. And that is a contesting view compared to the modern Dalit view of their identity. So how do we judge, how do we arbitrate between them? That is a problem. I'm very sympathetic to all the things Linda says about the embodiment of identity, and that completely applies in the case of caste as well. But if you rest only on the decolonization of it, it's not enough, because it can be used in very negative ways as well. Finally, well, 2 more slides, I think. Do we have to have a dialogue? We've tried to have a dialogue. Maybe it is something that we can do. But on the one hand, we have people who want to transcend religion. And on the other hand, there are people who actually are usurping the vocabulary of rights to stop the enactment of legislation. It's completely turned around. And if there has to be dialogue, and here I think in Berlusconi's paper on religion, he talks about dialogue between different religious groups. And it has to be between representatives, how would we select these representatives? Who's going to speak on behalf of the different religious groups that we want to engage in the dialogue? Now, the meaning of caste is being re-scripted, and its use and its role in identity, in all these exchanges that are happening between various actors. But there's also outside the academy, there are people who are outside, there are activists, and there are cultural productions that are happening completely outside the academic world. Some of us pay attention to this, but historically speaking, and this is my last slide, historically speaking, I think a grounded theory of caste which can take care of all the plural uses and also its new emerging forms, I think is missing. You know, in one sense, caste theories are trailing behind theories of race. There isn't, and there's a long explanation for it, which I could give another time. But one quick reason is that there's a late entry of intellectuals from amongst Dalits. That's only now taken place. And Ambedkar was an amazing exception, but he was neglected for so long. And so the challenge to boundaries that he began is kind of taking force a little bit now. For the first time in the 70s, we had writings of Dalits. In the 90s, they are being translated from the regional languages to English. And now it is becoming a part of thinking about it. And I think that the theory of caste itself is an actor in this genre. What I mean by this is that the public discourse itself is informed now by this theory. This is only happening now. And so we have to write, and when we write, we have to write with this awareness that we are not only writing for other academics. Just as we know that the opposition, I call them the opposition, this is the Hindus are using Orientalism and theory of Orientalism to further their cause. Well, where are our productions? Our theoretical productions have got to be such that it is possible for people to use them. So I say that the comprehensive theory of caste, which is itself an actor in this drama, is still in the dressing room. Thank you.
So thank you for that insightful presentation. So can I have your questions now, if you have any? I'll start from here. I'll follow the model of my colleague. So we'll start from the back, and the one immediately in front of you, and the third one here. So.
Oh, well, this sounds a bit frivolous, but it's meant to be serious. Do you think there are similarities with the English or British caste system? The House of Lords, and so on, the Church of England, etc., bishops in the House of Lords, which have a role in government, etc. What do you think of that? Do you think there are similarities there, particularly concerning the matter of identity?
Can I quickly just say, I think people have talked about even the British class system, even outside the parliament, and tried to say why, and how it is, there might be similarities in caste as well. But it's a question of how much and whether you can opt out of it, and how useful it is really to make that comparison. What are we trying to learn from this comparison? I'm not sure if making that comparison is really very helpful. So I'm sorry about that, but in our case, actually, it was the House of Lords which was more supportive. So it's a very strange situation.
So trying to figure out how much the debate's being shaped by it being a minority within a minority, it being sort of a debate happening in this country. So do the opposition, the kind of arguments that Lord Breck and so on putting forward, do they take those to apply to caste discrimination everywhere, or do they think there are kind of local particularities about the way things are happening in this country, which means that caste shouldn't be a protected characteristic? Do they think their arguments have kind of global appeal that nowhere there should be caste should be a protected characteristic, or do they think that it's particular to this country in the situation that we're in, we shouldn't have caste as a protected characteristic?
Yeah. Well, you want to know what are the links of what these people are saying back in India? Is that what you're asking?
So
Well, yes, there are parallel objections being raised in India as well. Particularly, they do it in a different way. For example, they are saying Dalits in this country are up in arms because what they really want is a reservation for Dalit Christians in India. So they are saying that there is this connection that the Dalits are making. So we've got to step back. It isn't a genuine really demand in this country. For their own part, they would like, if they could, to reduce the importance of caste in the Indian political scene, but they know that's pretty much impossible. We've gone too far down that line in India. Caste identification has become more and more part of the polity, and so it won't be possible. But in the sociological domain, I've mentioned Dipankar Gupta, who's a sociologist in India. Among sociologists, there is increasing acceptance of caste as a form of identification, and not. So the early post-independence feeling that it is something to be embarrassed or feel guilty about, and only the really staunch Hindus upheld it, but the others didn't. Now that feeling of the more spread Hinduization and acceptance has happened, right? So, does that answer your question?
I first wanted to say that I think that this argument of caste, like race, from a literary linguistic point of view, show them as signs of xenophobia. I think they're very acute forms of that. If you think about those things from the point of view of cultural states and not geopolitical states. I mean, there are identity cultures within cultures, et cetera, et cetera. And this example that you gave of the ACLC is evidence, perfect evidence of what Professor Berlusconi was talking about when he talked about the different forms of racism and that they're using what they've learned from anti-racist work to further their own cause. But then separately, I have a question about, do you think that, or do you have any thoughts about the recent election results in India and how they might hinder this, enacting of legal protections?
Yeah, I definitely want to say, I'm so glad you asked that question. The day after the election results came on, I can publicly say I almost wanted to have a fast one day, not talk to anybody, not eat anything. I don't keep fast, but that's how I felt. And it's the Prime Minister is from a state, Gujarat, which has been put forward as a state where there's been this fantastic model of development. Completely hidden at the other side of it, which is a report which came a few years ago by Martin McQuarrie, based on a study of about 1,589 villages. And it talks about the prevalence of caste and untouchability in Gujarat, the state of Gujarat. More than 94% of the villages, they still practice untouchability, as in not drinking from the same glass, not sitting in the same place. It is astonishing that level of untouchability exists in Gujarat, and yet it never made, nobody in the media thought of picking it up. It was doing the circles on Bahujan list and so on, but it didn't make it into the public domain. Nobody thought that. So the fact that there is still there are very deep problems within what is supposed to be this Hindu consensus, is completely hidden because the notion of we good Hindus is being tied to a certain kind of capitalist development. It's because people want to have what they call shining India, in which clearly there will be some people who will benefit a lot. They really want to forget about the dispossessed, and the dispossessed are in no position to challenge it. Absolutely no position to challenge it. So if you look at it in electoral terms, because of the electoral system we had as well, the Bahujan Samaj Party, BSP, which represents the Dalits in the country, their votes completely spread. 20% or so votes, I think they got nothing in the parliament. With 30% votes, the Bahujan the Bharatiya Janata Party, from which the Prime Minister comes, got the number of votes they got, 282 or something, with 30% of the votes. That's because of this electoral system we have. So I think I've drifted a long way from. Is that?
I mean, that's helpful, but I think, do you think, my suspicion is that the results of the election means that there's going to be a lot more difficulty than already exists.
I think so.
To enact legal protection that may already be codified.
Yeah.
It's going to be more difficult to implement.
It will be, because if there was an MP who went to Gujarat before this Prime Minister became the Prime Minister and met them for business purposes, and those very MPs are sitting in the Parliament. So if the Government Equality Office doesn't get its act together and get the consultation out, which it's supposed to do in this period before the Parliament changes, okay? But if it doesn't do it, by the time the next Parliament comes into place, whether it's the Labour or the Conservatives, whoever are in power, they would have by that time become even more susceptible to the influence of the Indian lobbies in the Parliament, and they can repeal the Section 97 era. The progress down. Yeah.
Thank you for that. I'll come back to you. Yeah. You.
I just want to talk a little bit about thinking of these questions in the specific nation, the specific history of Great Britain. And for me, it seems that questions of race and questions of caste are really kind of unintelligible without recourse to ideas about empire. Obviously the British didn't invent caste, but they did amplify and exploit caste when in India. Nicholas Dirks writes about this quite extensively. So I just wanted to ask you, in relation to that, how much you think how much traction these arguments you put forward could have in the specifically British terrain without a rigorous and a kind of unforgiving re-examination of Britain's particular imperial history. Without that, it can easily be articulated as, these are the backward practices of these people who are so far away, and once they're in the liberal, tolerant British space, these will all evaporate.
So can you speak up a little bit? I lost my the battery of my second hearing died today. I'm struggling to hear with one ear.
Yeah,
so if you could just the last part a little bit louder.
Yeah, I was just saying that at this time in which Mr. Gove is trying to present this kind of Disneyfied history of the British imperial past, I wanted to know how much you think that without a kind of a more penetrative examination of that, these questions about caste will actually be, engaged with in an honest manner rather than be dismissed as, the bad characteristics of.
Yeah, there's two ways I want to respond to that. I don't know if I will satisfy what you really want to know. One is that in the academic debate amongst historians of the colonial period, there is some agreement that the notion of caste acquired a particular character and got solidified because of certain practices of British administrators in India, as in census, etc., 1931 and so on. That is one part of it. There is an open question, and I don't take it as an open question, some people do, that whether or not caste existed before and in what form it existed. I follow Ambedkar in this, and I think if you look at religious reformers all the way going back to, from the 2nd century or even before, there have always been people who have challenged the caste system. And actually, even the fact that Manu had to write down these very strict laws in 200 AD shows that something was happening there. Something had changed before and something had to be brought back into place. So he had to write this law. So on that question of whether or not caste was it, whether it's an invention of the British, I think it is certainly not an invention of the British. The colonialism did play a role in giving it a certain shape, and after that the effect of it post-independence is clearly there still, but we can't travel back in time. Okay, so I take that view, we are where we are. This is where we have to start from. And if you now see from the other side of it, of those who were the beneficiaries of this system of classification, okay, which academics want to say is, and maybe upper caste want to say is an invention, those beneficiaries don't care about how their protection for them got institution. They want that protection. And so much so that I find it very interesting that when you go to public events like a rally or a meeting, people will clearly thank the British. Now you might feel a bit embarrassed if you are a post-colonial theorist and you're standing there and you're thinking, oh my God, why are they thanking the British Empire? But they are. There's that they thank the British for having instituted certain laws, or they're having removed this or that disability. That might have been, the intention of that might have been to establish the supremacy of Christianity. Who cares? Okay, so far as they are concerned, they are interested in the tool, the weapon they got. Okay, and I think that's what we've got to think about. And how do we bring together the academic interest that we have in having a theory of how things move, and in challenging categories, and the practical interest also of really listening to what people have done with the new rights or the new terms, and what are they doing with it. I think that the thing is to how we can bring those two together.
Thank you. So Nathaniel.
Thank you, Dr. Dhanda, for this presentation. I take it that we're engaged in at least 2 projects here today and tomorrow. First, we're building a community of scholars that can research, teach, and study the critical philosophy of race. And second, we're trying to identify what here in Britain we want the critical philosophy of race to do. Because it is going to have to do different things here for us than it has perhaps done for persons in the United States of America. And I guess both Professor Berlusconi and you, Dr. Dhanda, identified at least 2 areas for me. The reconstitution of the canon. And many people in the audience demanded a strategy for that. I guess Professor Berlusconi began to envisage a person who's already in the canon, and you, Dr. Dhanda, reintroduced someone who really should be in the canon, Dr. Bimrao Ramji Ambedkar, who was a philosopher, studied at Columbia, and as well as here in London, even though he was studied. It seems to me the second thing that we can ask the critical philosophy of race to do for us here in Britain is to try and understand how we might see similarities and differences between caste, or as I prefer to call it, Brahminist supremacy, and race, as I prefer to call it, white supremacy. Well, Bimrao Ramji Ambedkar had an answer for that. Endogamy. And he thought endogamy was at the root of both Brahminist supremacy and white supremacy. In fact, he thought that white supremacy, as it was operating in Ireland, was endogamous in this respect. Of course, so this needs to be interrogated. And this is something that philosophers can do. I take it that people, as you rightly say, I guess rules of endogamy still matter. The Hindu councils, individuals want to hold on to certainly their cultures, but also their individual right to associate with whomever they choose, especially when it comes to intimate association. But Imran Ranji Ambedkar argued in the Annihilation of Caste that the real remedy, and this is a quotation, the real remedy of caste is intermarriage. Nothing else will solve the serve as a solvent for caste. Now, we need to engage with that as philosophers. It requires us to engage with rights of intimate association, rights of association more generally, certainly, duties to associate, and duties to associate intimately.
I just want to say in that very essay, he also says quite a lot about the importance also of challenging Hinduism, the Shastras of the Hindus in the Annihilation of Castes, and I think that's a harder thing to do. I mean, in the context where we are so used to talking about religious pluralism, and we are so always sort of very careful about not to say anything offensive about X, Y, Z person. So the question about people recognizing internal critics of religions is hugely important. I think that's where the canon can change. You know, when we study Hinduism or when we study Sikhism or whatever it is we study, do we pay enough attention to those who have redefined that system of thought, that religion from within? Or do we take, usually the textbook versions of all of these things are just so naive and just continue to replicate what is the dominant view of that tradition. And that is where I think we can help somehow to pay attention to the neglected within those traditions and bring them out, pay attention. And as you mentioned about challenging the canon as in pointing the racism of the big thinkers. It's a bit like that, I mentioned Gandhi, Gandhi has become to be accepted a little bit, you have to think about what these big people have said and where there might be other people who are neglected you could bring into the canon.
Okay, maybe. Okay.
Let's carry on.
Yeah. Okay, maybe I'll take another.
Oh, that just came to my question. I was wondering whether there were any debates about how caste was defined, because with race you've got all these different conceptions, and part of the work of theorizing race is to bring out the contradictory conceptions of it and their importance for, say, political action. I was wondering how far that's important to your idea of the importance of a theory of caste, because I wanted to hear a little bit more about what a theory of caste could be a theory about, and how far there are debates within people who are interested in caste on the different ways of categorizing it, and that's very important.
By theory of caste, I don't mean it necessarily be anything unified, but I think so far we've had different followers of different traditions on caste. Okay, there is, and I couldn't find a way of bringing them all together. I mean, I'm not a social theorist directly, but I'm thinking now that it needs to be done. So my theory would, if there were a theory, ideally, would definitely also bring in groupings in terms of class into the equation. Not just think in terms of purity, pollution, occupation, etc. But think in terms of how caste plays a role in also this a capitalist system where you are, and that would, so try to bring the position of the individuals, but also located within a system. Yeah, that's what I'm so hopelessly vague on this because I'm only now beginning to think something is needed somewhere.
Time is against it, but I will take 3 questions just to end the section. So if you allow me, let me group the questions then.
Yeah.
So can I take one from you?
Yeah, sure. So going back to what you said, response before that, it seems to me that one of the most pressing areas in which to perform that task is in response to Islam, and how a particular very conservative interpretation of Islam has become has been allowed to become the dominant version both from a Western perspective, in which you could kind of paint all Muslims as advocates of honour killing and stoning and so on, and then that has simultaneously fed those groups within the Islamic community to kind of to rise to become the dominant ones. Do you think do you see any parallels there with what you've been speaking about today, in that the kind of double Orientalism thing you were discussing?
So I'll take the second question from. Okay, let me take it. Yeah.
This is a comment both on what Meena was saying and Nathaniel's comment. If Ambedkar was advocating intermarriage as a solution, that raises questions about what the role of the law could be in that, because obviously the legislation that you were after is not going to be enforcing intermarriage. And so I'm wondering whether or not that raises more general questions about what the law should be about this area. And it's an empirical question for me whether or not the people who said that caste was fading had it right, and reifying it by making people fill out questionnaires which would let people know what caste they were might set things in stone in ways that you wouldn't want. Or, and then on the topics that Nathaniel was raising, you might think that one role for the law is the nudge approach, where nudge is about creating incentives or removing barriers that would otherwise be there without actually requiring anything. It's associated obviously with Cass Sunstein and many others as well, but there's a lot that the law can do by way of nudging without enacting new duties.
Okay, thank you. So can I take my final question? Okay.
I've been surprised by some Indian authors' apparent resistance to the interpretation of casteism as racism. And I'm particularly thinking of Sundar Sarokar and Gopal Guru, whom you may know, who provide a very subtle account of the phenomenology of untouchability. And draw on an analysis in terms of the classical phenomenology that could, mutatis mutandis, be extended to the analysis of why they would have segregated drinking fountains in the American South, pre-civil rights. But then if you press them on this, what is the difference? They'll say, well, caste emerges out of a very deep history, goes back to antiquity. In some cases with the Dalits, it has to do with certain tabooed professions, and it has nothing to do with the way people look. And this takes for granted, which to my mind is a big problem, it takes for granted the idea that racism itself is some kind of extrapolation from the way people look, what sort of conduct one should therefore have towards them, which is really problematic. And so I wonder if in your reading of Indian authors on this particular question, you detected maybe an inadequate analysis of what racism itself is.
Yeah. Can I say? Okay, I'll start from the last one because I absolutely agree with you. Although I do like to read Gopal Guru, and that text, The Cracked Mirror, is a very, very good discussion between two philosophers on the phenomenology of untouchability. It is really very good, and it makes you think so much. But it draws actually connections with Ambedkar as well, And I agree completely that it is an inadequate understanding of how racism works that is at the heart of this resistance to see the two in genuinely comparative terms. As functioning as systems which debilitate people, which not allow people to be themselves, to flourish. It's that, and the fact that they only work in, you see them, how the exchanges that happen between people. And it works the same way as it, between people. It's not clearly about the power from above, but it's also what happens between people. So I completely agree with everything that what you said. On the first question, yes, there is a double Orientalism, if you like, and I sometimes say to these critics that you're the ones who are ignoring our own ancient critics of the caste system. You are so enamored by the British critics, you call the Christian critics. Yeah, why do you forget our own heroes? So I am more a nationalist than you are in that way. That come with me and see who are the people who have criticized the system, and listen to them. Forget about the the British colonialism. Okay, so that's just a rhetorical answer, but I agree. Ray, it's very interesting that you mentioned it. Of course, on the question of intermarriage, you can't ask people to marry, but you can do other things. Yeah. Which in India, for example, there is a provision made that if people marry outside caste, the state, several states have instituted it, would give a grant of some money, 50,000 rupees in some cases, to set up your own home. Now the interesting thing is that I've written about this in my paper, Runaway Marriages, A Silent Revolution. The interesting thing is that the people face the same problems. They are not able to get the grant. The form itself costs money. The person who's going to give you the form to apply for the grant is going to use his power to first give me 2,000 rupees, then I'll give you the form. Everything that infects, otherwise is itself a part of the caste system also becomes an obstacle in the implementation of this, remedy. So that tells you how individual remedies, where there are several other individual remedies. Likewise, the other remedy, which is the Prevention of Atrocities Act. Okay, the Prevention of Atrocities Act in India is a remedy which could be used. For example, if there is a person who wants to marry and is being hounded by parents, it could kick in to stop those who are to get state protection. Even now, the couples can go into a court and say, I've run away, I'm marrying, and give me protection. And the way it works is fascinating. That the judge there, actually, the case is made against the local superintendent of police, who is a functionary. That I fear that this person is going to falsely arrest me. Okay, because I am marrying, and then it goes on from there. So it is possible to have measures, but we have to think about why these measures don't work, even when they are instituted. What else needs changing before that can happen? And finally, on the census question, well, it's certainly not going to happen here. People have those fears about Equality Act doesn't need people to identify themselves as a member of this or that caste for it to work at all. And there's some other fears associated, whether or not people can have associations based on caste. They can carry on having association based on caste. The Equality Act is not going to stop it. But what will happen is that there will be a new spotlight on the association. People will have to think, is it right to have an association based on caste? And the younger generation, maybe others will think, why should there be an association in which only members of this caste can be a member? So there are several Gujarati associations, for example, which are caste-based. And there are penalties. So if a woman from that Gujarati association, I have a case like that, wanted to marry outside caste, she was told she can't remain a member of that association. Now that would be actionable under the Act, yeah?
Thank you very much, Dr. Meena. So thank to all of you.